The morning of April 18, 1943, began in silence. Across Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, a humid darkness still clung to the earth, thick and heavy as wet wool. The air smelled of aviation fuel and rotting jungle, of salt and rust and the particular staleness that comes from too many men living too close to death for too long. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters sat in neat rows, their twin-boom silhouettes ghostly in the pre-dawn murk, their polished aluminum skins already beating with condensation. Mechanics moved between them like sleepwalkers, checking fuel lines, testing flaps, running practiced hands over control surfaces they had touched 1,000 times before. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Nobody asked questions. Orders had come down from the highest levels with a single word stamped across them in red ink: secret. The pilots gathering in the operations tent didn't know who they were hunting that morning. They knew only that it was someone important enough to kill. Someone important enough to die for. Major John Mitchell stood before a map of the Solomon Islands, his finger tracing a route that looked less like a flight plan and more like a suicide note. The distance alone was staggering: 435 miles from Guadalcanal to the intercept point near Bougainville, all of it over open ocean, all of it at wave-top altitude to avoid Japanese radar. The P-38s would be flying at the absolute edge of their range, pushed to limits that the manufacturer had never intended, carrying nothing but full internal tanks and maximum ammunition. No bombs. No drop tanks beyond what they already had. Just guns and fuel and the paper-thin hope that the math was right. Mitchell's voice was steady as he briefed the mission, but his eyes betrayed him, the eyes of a man who had done the calculations 3 times and still didn't quite believe them. They would have maybe 15 minutes over the target area. 15 minutes to find, engage, and destroy before their fuel ran out. Then it would be a race back to Guadalcanal, engines sputtering on fumes, praying that the winds and the ocean and the laws of physics would show them mercy one more time. The pilots listening to him were so young it almost hurt to look at them. First Lieutenant Rex Barber was 24 years old, his face still smooth and boyish despite the exhaustion that lived permanently behind his eyes. Captain Thomas Lanfear was 25, handsome and confident in the way that men who haven't yet learned to doubt themselves can be. They sat on folding chairs in their flight suits, sweat already darkening the fabric under their arms, their leather helmets dangling from their hands. Some of them smoked. Some of them stared at the map as if they could memorize the ocean itself. One pilot quietly checked and rechecked his watch, a nervous tick that he probably didn't even know he was doing. They were the best pilots in the South Pacific, hand-picked for this mission, veterans of Guadalcanal who had survived when so many others hadn't. But in that moment, in that stifling tent with the kerosene lamps casting long shadows across their faces, they looked like what they were, kids pretending to be warriors, bound together by duty and terror and a kind of desperate, unspoken love for each other that men only feel when they know that some of them won't be coming back. Mitchell finished the briefing with a sentence that would echo in their minds for the rest of their lives. "Gentlemen," he said, looking each of them in the eye, "we're going to kill somebody important today. I don't know who. You don't need to know who. But naval intelligence says this is worth it. So we're going to do it right." Nobody asked questions. Nobody needed to. In war, you learn not to ask why. You learn to trust that someone, somewhere up the chain of command, had made a decision that mattered. You learn to believe that your death, if it came, would mean something. Even if you never knew what. 350 miles to the north, on the island of Rabaul, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was already awake. He had always been an early riser, a habit formed during his years at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, and reinforced by decades of service. At 59 years old, he carried himself with the measured dignity of a man who had seen enough of the world to understand its cruelties and enough of war to know that he was living on borrowed time. His quarters were sparse: tatami mats, a low writing table, a single scroll hanging on the wall with a poem about cherry blossoms falling in spring. He had written it himself years ago, in a different life, when he still believed that Japan could avoid the coming storm. Now, sitting cross-legged in the gray light before dawn, he read it again and felt only a distant sadness, like remembering the face of someone who had died long ago. Yamamoto had never wanted this war. History would remember him as the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had struck the first blow against the sleeping giant, but history, as always, would be incomplete. He had opposed the war from the beginning, had argued in imperial conferences that attacking America was madness, that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity. He had said famously, prophetically, that he could run wild for 6 months after the war began, but after that, he could promise nothing. He had been right, of course. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece and a strategic catastrophe. It had awakened the giant and filled it with a terrible resolve. Now, 16 months later, Japan was losing. Slowly, inexorably, the tide had turned. Midway had been a disaster. Guadalcanal, a grinding nightmare of attrition that Japan could not afford. Every day brought fresh reports of losses, ships, planes, pilots who could never be replaced. Yamamoto knew how it would end. He had always known. But duty was duty, and honor was honor, and so he continued to serve, continued to plan, continued to lead men to their deaths in a cause that he knew was already lost. That morning, he prepared for an inspection tour of Japanese airfields in the Northern Solomons. The trip had been planned for weeks, part of a broader effort to boost morale among the frontline units. He would visit Bin, Shortland, and Balail, speak to the pilots, praise their courage, remind them that the Emperor was watching, that their sacrifices mattered. It was the kind of duty he had performed 100 times before, necessary, exhausting, and ultimately futile. The young pilots would cheer when he arrived. Some of them would die within the week. He bathed carefully, dressed in his olive-green uniform, and buckled his ceremonial katana at his side. The sword had been in his family for generations, a blade forged in the 17th century, its edge still sharp, its grip worn smooth by the hands of men who had carried it through wars that were now barely remembered. He touched it briefly, almost unconsciously, the way a man might touch a talisman before walking into darkness. His chief of staff, Vice Admiral Mato Megaki, found him standing at the window, looking out at the harbor where the remnants of the combined fleet lay at anchor. Megaki was 10 years younger, fiercely loyal, and so devoted to Yamamoto that the other staff officers sometimes joked, quietly, carefully, that he loved the Admiral more than his own family. He stood at attention and reported that the aircraft were ready. 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers, Bettys, the Americans called them, escorted by 60 fighters. Wheels up at 6 a.m. arrival at Balail by 9:45. Everything on schedule. Yamamoto nodded. He did not smile. He rarely smiled anymore. Let's not keep them waiting, he said, and walked out into the morning light. At 7:10 a.m., 18 P-38 Lightnings lifted off from Henderson Field in pairs, their twin Allison engines roaring in the humid dawn. The noise was deafening, a mechanical thunder that rolled across the jungle and sent flocks of parrots screaming into the sky. One by one, they climbed, banked, and formed up into 2 groups, a killer section of 4 planes tasked with attacking the bombers, and a cover section of 14 to keep the Zeros busy. Mitchell led the formation out over the water, dropping to less than 50 feet above the waves, so low that the pilots could see the faces of startled seabirds skimming the surface. At that altitude, they were invisible to Japanese radar, but they were also flying blind, navigating by dead reckoning and compass, trusting that Mitchell's calculations were correct, that the winds would hold, that the target would be where intelligence said it would be. The ocean stretched out before them, endless and indifferent, a blue-gray expanse broken only by whitecaps and the occasional floating debris from ships that had died weeks or months before. Inside their cramped cockpits, the pilots flew in silence, the roar of their engines too loud for radio chatter, their eyes scanning the horizon, their hands light on the controls. The fuel gauges crept steadily toward empty. Yamamoto's bomber lifted off from Rabaul at precisely 6 a.m., right on schedule. The second bomber followed close behind, carrying Igaki and the rest of the staff. The 6 Zeros formed up around them in a loose defensive pattern, their engines droning in the tropical heat. Inside the lead Betty, Yamamoto sat in the rear of the cabin, staring out the window at the ocean below. He did not read. He did not talk. He simply sat, his hands folded in his lap, his katana resting beside him, his face composed and unreadable. Across from him, a young staff officer tried to make conversation, some nervous remark about the weather, but Yamamoto did not respond. He was somewhere else, lost in thoughts that no one would ever know. Perhaps he was thinking of his childhood in Niigata, where the snow fell deep in winter and the plum blossoms bloomed early in spring. Perhaps he was thinking of his years in America, studying at Harvard, walking the streets of Washington, learning to love a country he would one day attack. Perhaps he was thinking of nothing at all, simply existing in the liminal space between duty and death, waiting for whatever came next. The bomber droned on, steady and level, its engines loud but reassuring, its shadow racing across the water far below. At 9:33 a.m., Lieutenant Doug Canning, flying in the killer section, spotted them first. 2 bombers and 6 fighters, exactly as intelligence had predicted, flying in formation at 4,000 feet, just off the coast of Bougainville. For a moment, nobody moved. It felt unreal, impossible, like stumbling across a ghost. Then Canning's voice crackled over the radio, flat and professional. "Bogies. 11 o'clock high." Mitchell's response was immediate. "All right, skin 'em off." The cover section peeled away to engage the Zeros. The 4 planes of the killer section, Barber, Lanfear, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Ray Hine, shoved their throttles forward and began to climb, engines screaming, adrenaline spiking through their veins like electricity. Below them, the ocean fell away. Above them, the bombers, impossibly fragile, impossibly close, began to dive for the jungle canopy. The Zeros reacted instantly. They broke formation and came down like falling knives, their pilots screaming into their radios, desperate to protect the bombers. But they were too far away, and the Americans were too fast. Barber and Lanfear closed the distance in seconds, their P-38s roaring up through the sky, their cannons and machine guns armed and ready. Barber went for the first bomber. He could see it clearly now, the dark green paint, the red rising sun insignia on the fuselage, the frantic movements of the crew inside. He squeezed the trigger. The nose cannon roared, and tracers arced through the air, 50 caliber rounds and 20 mm shells converging on the bomber's right engine. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The engine exploded in a gout of black smoke and orange flame. The bomber's wing dipped violently, and it began to fall, spiraling down toward the jungle below, trailing fire and debris like a dying comet. Barber flashed past it, his heart hammering, his hands shaking on the controls, and in the fraction of a second that he was close enough to see through the cockpit glass, he thought he saw a figure inside, sitting upright, staring straight ahead, calm even in the moment of death. The bomber hit the jungle canopy at over 200 miles per hour. It did not skip or tumble. It simply disintegrated, a sudden violent eruption of metal and flesh and fuel, scattering wreckage across half an acre of rainforest. Trees snapped like matchsticks. A fireball rolled up through the canopy, black smoke boiling into the clear blue sky. Then silence. The kind of silence that follows violence, when the world seems to hold its breath and wait for the ringing in its ears to stop. Barber pulled up hard, his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces, his engine coughing as fuel sloshed in the tanks. Behind him, Lanfear was chasing the second bomber, but Barber didn't see what happened. He was already turning for home, his fuel gauge reading nearly empty, his mind blank with shock and exhaustion and the terrible, exhilarating realization that he was still alive. The flight back to Guadalcanal was the longest of their lives. The P-38s limped home on fumes, their engines sputtering and coughing, their fuel tanks reading 0, then somehow finding a few more gallons, then 0 again. Mitchell navigated by instinct and prayer, keeping the formation low over the water, watching for the silhouette of Guadalcanal to rise out of the haze. One by one, they landed at Henderson Field, their wheels touching down on the steel matting with the jarring thud of machines that had been pushed beyond their limits. Mechanics swarmed the planes, checking for damage, pumping fuel into the tanks, and finding them bone dry, some with less than a gallon remaining. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits and stood on the wing roots, their legs shaking, their flight suits soaked through with sweat, their faces pale and stunned. Nobody spoke. Nobody celebrated. They didn't know yet who they had killed. They knew only that they had done what they were sent to do, and that, against every law of probability and fuel consumption, they had made it home. In the jungle near Bin, on the southern coast of Bougainville, a Japanese search party moved cautiously through the wreckage. They had seen the bomber go down, had watched it fall like a burning star into the canopy, and now they hacked their way through vines and undergrowth, following the smell of burning fuel and the column of smoke that rose lazily into the still air. The heat was unbearable. The humidity made it hard to breathe. Insects swarmed over everything, drawn by the blood and the fire. When they finally reached the crash site, they stopped and stared in silence. The bomber had broken apart on impact, scattering pieces across a wide area. The tail section hung upside down in a tree, its tail gunner still strapped in his seat, his body unrecognizable. The fuselage had torn open like a tin can, spilling bodies and equipment into the mud. But near the nose, still strapped upright in his seat as if he were simply waiting for the plane to take off again, sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He had died instantly. 2 bullets had struck him, one through the left shoulder blade exiting through his jaw, the other through his lower back. His uniform was torn and scorched, his face blackened by smoke, but his posture was still dignified, still composed, his hands still folded in his lap. His katana lay across his knees, the blade gleaming dully in the filtered jungle light, as if he had drawn it in the final seconds before the crash, and then carefully laid it across his legs before dying. The search party commander, a young lieutenant whose name history would not record, stood before the body for a long moment, his face pale, his hands trembling. Then, slowly, he came to attention and saluted. Around him, the other soldiers did the same. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? The man who had led them, who had inspired them, who had promised them victory even as he knew it was impossible, that man was dead, killed by enemy fighters, shot down in flames over a jungle that would swallow his body and his memory like all the others who had died in this cursed, forgotten war. They carried the body back to Bin by nightfall, wrapping it carefully in a parachute silk, treating it with the reverence due a fallen emperor. The news spread through the Japanese forces in the Solomons like a shockwave, disbelief giving way to grief, grief giving way to a kind of numb, hollow despair. For 3 weeks, the Imperial High Command kept the news secret, fearing the effect it would have on national morale. When they finally announced his death on May 21st, they said only that he had died while directing operations at the front. They did not say that he had been ambushed. They did not say that American codebreakers had read their communications, that the Americans had known exactly where he would be, exactly when, and had sent hunters to meet him. They did not say that the greatest naval strategist of the war had been killed not by superior tactics or overwhelming force, but by a handful of young men flying obsolete planes at the very edge of their range, gambling everything on a single moment of violence that lasted less than 2 minutes. To say those things would have been to admit a kind of vulnerability that the Japanese people, already reeling from defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, could not afford to face. In Washington, when the news arrived, there was celebration, but it was a strange, muted kind of celebration, tinged with something that felt uncomfortably close to guilt. Yamamoto had been the enemy, yes, but he had also been a known quantity, a man whose strategies and tendencies were understood, whose presence in the Japanese command structure had been both a threat and a source of predictability. His death created a vacuum that would be filled by unknown men, younger men, perhaps more reckless men. Some intelligence officers argued that killing him had been a tactical victory but a strategic mistake. Others countered that his death was a blow to Japanese morale that could not be quantified, a symbolic victory that mattered as much as any battle. Both were probably right. War is full of such contradictions, actions that are simultaneously brilliant and foolish, necessary and tragic, heroic and horrifying. Yamamoto's death was all of these things at once. The pilots who killed him would be celebrated, decorated, interviewed, lionized. Some of them would spend the rest of their lives arguing about who had fired the fatal shots, each claiming the kill, each needing to believe that their hand had been the one to strike the blow. Others would fall silent, haunted by the memory of that burning bomber spiraling into the jungle, wondering what it meant to kill a man who, in another life, they might have called a friend. Yamamoto's body was cremated with full military honors in Tokyo. His ashes were divided, half were interred at the Tama Cemetery, half at his family temple in Nagaoka. Emperor Hirohito posthumously awarded him the Grand Order of the Chrysanthemum, the highest honor Japan could bestow. Over 1 million people lined the streets of Tokyo for his funeral procession, weeping openly, bowing low as the cortege passed. It was a display of grief that Japan had not seen since the death of Emperor Meiji in 1912, and would not see again until Hirohito's own death decades later. But even as the nation mourned, the war ground on. The battles for the Solomons continued. The slow, brutal island-hopping campaign across the Pacific accelerated. The air war intensified. More planes fell from the sky. More bodies were swallowed by the jungle and the sea. Yamamoto's death changed nothing and everything. It removed a brilliant mind from the Japanese command. It deprived Japan of a leader who understood America well enough to fear it. It gave the Americans a psychological edge, a proof that even the greatest of their enemies could be found, hunted, killed. But it did not shorten the war. If anything, it made the war more savage. The men who replaced Yamamoto were younger, less cautious, more willing to embrace desperate tactics. The kamikaze strategy that would define the final year of the Pacific War was born, in part, from the vacuum left by his death. Vice Admiral Igaki, who had survived the attack because he had been in the second bomber, became one of the war's most haunting figures. He spent the remainder of the conflict consumed by guilt, tormented by the knowledge that he had lived while Yamamoto had died, driven by a fanatic determination to avenge his fallen commander. On August 15, 1945, the day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Igaki refused to accept defeat. He climbed into a kamikaze plane, strapped on a ceremonial headband, and flew off into the dusk, searching for an American ship to crash into, determined to die as he believed Yamamoto would have wanted him to die. He never found a target. His plane disappeared into the Pacific, lost without a trace, another ghost in an ocean already crowded with them. Whether he died in a futile gesture of loyalty, or simply vanished into the waves, whether his death had meaning or was merely the final act of a man who had outlived his purpose, these are questions that have no answers. History remembers him only as a footnote, the man who survived when his commander did not, the loyal staff officer who could not bear to outlive the war. The young American pilots who flew the mission scattered to the winds of time. John Mitchell rose to the rank of colonel and lived a quiet life, shunning publicity, rarely speaking of the mission. Rex Barber became a businessman, haunted occasionally by nightmares but otherwise unremarkable. Tom Lanfear spent decades arguing that he had been the one to shoot down Yamamoto, writing articles, giving interviews, fighting legal battles over the credit. The truth, that multiple pilots had fired on multiple targets in a chaotic 30-second engagement, was less satisfying to him than the narrative of a single, heroic kill. But history is not made of clean narratives. History is made of confusion and contradiction, of moments that happen too fast to fully understand, of men who do violent things for reasons they cannot always articulate, and then spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of what they did and why. The mission succeeded, but its success was messy, ambiguous, contested. Like all of war. In the years after the war ended, as scholars sifted through Japanese records and interviewed survivors, a fuller picture of Yamamoto emerged. He had been a gambler and a poet, a modernizer and a traditionalist, a man who loved American movies and jazz music, who had lived in the United States and understood its people better than almost any other Japanese officer. He had opposed the alliance with Nazi Germany, had argued against the attack on Pearl Harbor, had warned his superiors that provoking America was suicide. But when his country gave the order, he had obeyed. Duty, in the end, had been stronger than doubt. Honor had been stronger than wisdom. And so he had planned the attack that killed thousands, had led the fleet that brought Japan to the brink of victory, and then had watched helplessly as that victory slipped away, month by month, battle by battle, until there was nothing left but the long, terrible slide toward defeat. He had known it was coming. He had said so, again and again, in letters to friends, in private conversations, in the poetry he wrote late at night when he could not sleep. "I can run wild for 6 months," he had said before Pearl Harbor, and he had been right almost to the day. Midway had been fought 6 months and 4 days after Pearl Harbor. After Midway, the war was lost. It would take 3 more years for Japan to admit it, 3 more years of dying, but the outcome was never in doubt again. Yamamoto had known. And knowing, he had served anyway, had continued to lead, continued to fight, continued to climb into that bomber on the morning of April 18, 1943, even though some part of him must have understood that he was flying toward his death. There is a photograph, taken in 1934, of Yamamoto standing on the deck of a battleship, dressed in full uniform, his sword at his side, staring directly at the camera with an expression that is impossible to read. Some people see sadness in that expression. Others see determination, or resignation, or a kind of weary acceptance. Perhaps it is all of those things. Perhaps the photograph captures something essential about the man, his intelligence, his melancholy, his awareness of the tragedy unfolding around him even before the war began. Or perhaps it is just a photograph, a two-dimensional image frozen in time, onto which we project our own need to find meaning in the senseless, order in the chaos, humanity in the machinery of war. Yamamoto is dead. The pilots who killed him are dead. The war they fought is history now, distant and incomprehensible to generations who have never known what it means to fly through the dawn with the fuel gauge reading empty, or to sit quietly in a bomber while the jungle rises up to meet you, or to mourn a leader who led you into a war he knew you could not win. What remains? A sword, mostly. Yamamoto's katana, recovered from the wreckage, cleaned and polished and displayed now under museum glass, its blade still sharp after 80 years, its presence both magnificent and unbearably sad. Visitors stop and stare at it, this relic of a forgotten age, this weapon that was never used in anger, carried into battle by a man who spent his life trying to avoid war and died because he could not. The blade catches the light, gleaming softly, beautiful and cold. Beside it, a placard explains its history, 17th century forging, handed down through the Yamamoto family for generations, recovered from the crash site on Bougainville, April 18, 1943. The placard does not mention the heat of that day, the smell of burning fuel, the insects swarming over the bodies, the young lieutenant standing at attention with tears streaming down his face. The placard does not mention the American pilots landing back at Guadalcanal with empty tanks and shaking hands, or the years of guilt and argument and memory that followed. The placard does not mention Igaki's final flight into oblivion, or the million people weeping in the streets of Tokyo, or the way the war continued for 2 more years, grinding on and on until there was nothing left to grind. The sword says all of this anyway. It says everything that cannot be put into words. The cost of duty, the weight of honor, the unbearable loneliness of command, the terrible beauty of a well-made weapon that has survived its maker. It lies there under glass, silent and eternal, a reminder that war is not made by nations or governments or abstract ideals. War is made by human beings. It is made by young men who climb into cockpits at dawn, not because they are brave but because they are told to, and by old men who accept death with dignity, not because they are resigned but because they see no other path. It is made by choices that seem inevitable only in hindsight, by moments of violence that last seconds and echo through lifetimes, by acts of courage and cowardice and sacrifice that are so tangled together that no one, not the historians, not the survivors, not even the men who were there, can ever fully separate them. On the morning of April 18, 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto climbed into a bomber at Rabaul and flew north to die. 200 miles away, 18 young American pilots took off from Henderson Field and flew north to kill him. Neither group knew the other existed. Neither group had any choice in the matter. Duty had drawn them together, destiny had arranged the meeting, and mathematics, cold, impersonal, indifferent mathematics, had calculated the exact moment and place where their trajectories would intersect. 20 minutes of flight. 104 bullet holes. .50 caliber rounds striking home. A bomber falling from the sky. A body strapped in a seat, hands folded, sword gleaming. The death of a man who had tried to prevent the war he was killed fighting, brought down by boys who had no idea who they were killing, in a jungle that would erase all evidence of the encounter within a year, leaving nothing behind but the sword, the stories, and the terrible, enduring mystery of what any of it meant. The sword lies under glass, gleaming. Museum visitors pass by, pausing briefly, reading the placard, moving on. Outside, the world continues, cars honking, children laughing, the hum of aircraft overhead, the ordinary noise of a peaceful afternoon. History has become artifact. Memory has become display. The men are gone. The war is over. Only the sword remains, silent witness to a 20-minute encounter over the Solomon Islands 80 years ago, when the fate of empires was decided by the squeeze of a trigger, the fall of a bomber, the quiet dignity of a man who knew that the end was coming and met it without flinching. It gleams under the museum lights, beautiful and cold, carrying within its steel all the contradictions of war, the courage and the cruelty, the honor and the horror, the unbearable sadness of lives cut short and the incomprehensible luck of those who survived. It is a weapon. It is a work of art. It is a tomb. It is all that remains of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, prophet of defeat, the man who ran wild for 6 months and then fell silent in the jungle, on a morning when the sky was clear and the ocean was calm and 18 young Americans flew north to kill someone they had never met, for reasons they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand.